So our speaker this session is a former police officer and lawyer with 33 years of policing and legal experience. Mick joined the Northern Territory Police in 1963 and rose through the ranks to become the Commissioner of that organisation in 1988. In 1994 he was appointed as the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police and he served in that position for 7 years. In that position, Mick was the head law enforcement officer of the Australian Government. I hope we're all going to be very gracious today and not hold that against him. He's also the recipient of the Australian Police Medal and has also received an Order of Australia for his work in policing. So with 33 years of experience in policing, he comes to us today with a wealth of knowledge about the practice of law enforcement and the knowledge about the practice of drug prohibition and how that affects police work. As one of his jobs since retiring from the police force, he's become a public advocate for liberalisation of Australia's drug prohibition laws. And that's the topic he's going to be speaking about today to all of us. So can you please make him feel very welcome, Mr. Mick Palmer.
Thanks very much, folks. Really appreciate the opportunity to just share a few thoughts with you. And I've got no props, so I'm all you get. As you can see by the way I'm dressed, I've lived my life in a regulated environment, as Ben alluded to, and worked with governments for most of my life, although since 2001, I retired in 2001, I've been doing freelance sort of consultation work, mostly for state and federal governments, but some for private industry, the gas industry and so on, in regard to sort of governance-related inquiries and so on. I was asked to share some thoughts with you on the state of play in terms of Australia's drug prohibitionist laws, and I guess I'd like to start with just a couple of reflections on my own life. I grew up in the 50s and 60s when my recollections or knowledge and understanding of drugs was almost nil. I didn't have any friends who took drugs. We all drank far more than we should have. I understand some people were here at 4 o'clock or somewhere till 4 o'clock this morning, so probably I'm not completely in isolation with that. Drank far too much. Most of my friends smoked traditional cigarettes, but drugs were almost a non-event in the circles in which I mixed, which would be very unlikely for young people today, no matter in what circles you mix. I went to the Northern Territory. When I joined the Northern Territory Police, you had to be male, 21 and single. And I was male, 21 and single. And you wouldn't get away with that these days either, of course. We had to get a commissioned officer's approval to get married, and I had a mate who got knocked back. And so, it was a different world in which we lived. But again, so I went up there with a pretty hard and fast, I had no aspirations to be a law enforcement officer until I saw a photograph in the paper one day of a fellow sitting on the bonnet of a four-wheel drive with a .303 rifle across his chest saying, "Come and join the Northern Territory Police." I thought that sounds like a bit of fun. So I went up there really for a couple of years' experience, fell in love with the place and the job and stayed, essentially. But, and formed my laws, my views on law enforcement and things like drug prohibition during the course of that experience. Initially, I guess like most people who get attracted to things like law enforcement, tend to be a bit right of centre, I suppose, in terms of your basic views. I didn't have too much sympathy or time for people who took drugs, didn't understand why they do it, and if they got locked up, it was their fault. Of course, the more you look at that, the more flawed you find that logic is, and the more flawed I found it was even during the course of my early career. And it reminded me of my own experience when I was still on probation in policing, and because you had to be male and single, everybody lived in police barracks until such time as you got approval to get married. We had a night after a football game on the booze and finished up on the roof, half of a dozen of us of the police barracks accommodation, having had far too much to drink, singing sort of raucous songs, to the extent where the next door neighbour, who was Douglas Lockwood, the famous Australian author, who was a terrific supporter of police, eventually and reluctantly phoned the police station to say, "Look, I hate complaining against my young colleagues and neighbours, they do a great job, but this is 3 o'clock in the morning, they're creating mayhem and I'm terrified one of them's going to fall off the roof." So police came and asked us would we kindly go to bed, which of course we did. But the reason I mention that story is, and went cap in hand the next morning to apologise to Douglas Lockwood for being such an idiot, is that when you're young you do stupid things, you know, and had people known that I did that at the time I did it, I probably wouldn't have been confirmed, let alone finished up becoming Commissioner of the organisation some 20 years later. So the same can be said of young people who experiment with things like drugs. And to treat the behaviour as criminal rather than social and a health issue, of course, is almost counterproductive. My experience has really led me to conclude a few things. Essentially, our current prohibitionist policy is totally broken, probably always was, is ineffective, and has no chance of having the effect that it's aimed as having. You can't police yourself out of a social problem, police yourself your way out of a social problem. Despite our best endeavours over many years, drugs are more readily available now than they've ever been. As I said, when I was a young guy, I didn't know many people who used them, didn't know anybody that used them actually. Didn't know where to buy them, would have had trouble sourcing them. No young people you talk to these days have any of those difficulties. So in terms of law enforcement having an impact and reducing the marketplace, clearly it hasn't done so. And law enforcement now is probably more effective, better resourced, and has more significant results, if you like, in terms of large seizures and arrests of prominent people than it's ever done. But it makes no difference. It makes no difference. Experimentation among young people is probably at an all-time high, with an ever-widening array of drugs, as you know, with ice now at the pinnacle of the problem and availability than ever before. The marketplace is totally unregulated and controlled by organised crime and violent crime figures and traffickers who make huge profits, pay no tax. Many of us would support the fact that that's not a bad idea, and follow no rules other than their own. And most of those rules are based around violent conduct for anybody that doesn't play by their rules. The quality of drugs trafficked is totally unregulated in that nobody knows what they're really buying. And buyers sometimes don't even know the product they're buying. They're told it's one thing, it may in fact be something entirely different. We've all heard the stories of rat poison and the like. Drug-dependent users, sadly, are treated as criminals, and so are frequently unlikely to confide in family or friends as the cause of any medical problems when they occur, or to seek medical attention, telling the truth to doctors, on the basis they might get themselves and their friends in trouble if they do. We have many, and I have a personal family connection with that sort of story, where the young fellow wasn't prepared to tell his parents what his problem was, as a result of which it wasn't properly diagnosed, as a result of which he died. All of that makes no sense at all to me. Law enforcement strategies are unavoidably discriminatory, in that only a very small percentage of the total users fall foul of the legal system. About 180 million people worldwide use cannabis. Over 3 million are assessed to use it in Australia, as well as now almost the same numbers in other drugs, amphetamines and ice and the like. We lock up a tiny percentage of that number. But if you're unlucky enough to get caught up in the net and arrested, it may have a big impact on your life and your future. When after 15 years in the Northern Territory, I left to study law, and I studied law in Queensland and went to the private bar for a couple of years in the 80s, 82 and 83. While I was there, I tried to do civil practice coming out of a police background. I didn't know that I wanted really to be defending too many people in a criminal environment. Found people quickly became aware that I was an ex-police officer, so they wanted me to handle criminal matters. And I found the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it, and the more I realised there were two sides to the coin. And some of these people were very decent people who may or may not have done something stupid or silly or inappropriate, but deserved to be properly defended, and the police didn't always by any means get it right in any case. One of the early cases that really again caused me to think carefully about the drug prohibitionist policy was I found myself defending, or at least appearing on a legal aid brief, the fellows that agreed to plead guilty, a group of young men who in a house on the Gold Coast, surfer sort of residence where 8 or 10 young guys were having a holiday and surfing every day, smoking a bit of pot. Neighbours had complained about a noisy party, police had arrived, arrested everybody in the house for either use or possession of cannabis or possessing cannabis smoking instruments, bongs and the like, and they're all before the court on a variety of these offences. 2 of them, I remember well, had just applied for and were waiting acceptance into the Defence Force. 1 had applied for the Queensland Police and 2 were trainee teachers. All of those futures were threatened by conviction, and most of them had convictions despite we were able to stave off a couple of convictions, offence proven without proceeding to conviction, but those that had convictions, a number were planning to go to America on holidays. They wouldn't get a visa with a drug conviction. So for something as simple and as basic as just having a night out and smoking a bit of pipe, nowhere near as serious as my silly kerfuffle on the veranda on the roof of the police barracks, when I was supposed to be upholding the very laws that I was offending, was going to cost them a lot in their futures. And in fact, my understanding of it, the two guys who applied for the Defence Force were not accepted. The next door neighbours, some of whom came to court because we thought about using them as character witnesses, involved another young group of guys who weren't picked up in the police net, two of whom were also going to join the Defence Force. Of course, they went ahead and joined, were accepted. The two guys picked up with the bongs were rejected. The penalty far outweighed the crime, if in fact it should have been a crime at all. So it made me think about a whole range of things, and I guess we've all been watching with a fair bit of interest, whatever our personal views are, the Chan and Sukumaran case, what the reality of this marketplace is, and what good we achieve and what harms we cause by the current way we go about business. That is, in criminalising the conduct of everybody involved in the drug environment, illicit drug environment, rather than just the producers and the traffickers. Sukumaran and Chan were arrested in Indonesia, as you know, for trying to import about 8 kilograms of heroin. In 1998, when I was Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, we apprehended a yacht off the coast of Port Macquarie carrying 390 kilograms of heroin, 50 times almost, 50 times what Chan and Sukumaran were importing, or trying to import. Not condoning what they did for a minute. That seizure and the arrests that surrounded that seizure made absolutely no difference to the price, to the availability, the supply market in New South Wales or in Eastern Australia. Despite the fact, and we lauded it, we had press conferences where we said we've taken so many million hits of heroin off the streets, saved so many lives, really most of that's rhetoric. At the end of the day, the supply is an inexhaustible. It's a bit like the terrorist market. You can't cut the head off this serpent anymore. There's no Mr. Big in charge of the organisation, and you cut Mr. Big out and all of a sudden the organisation crumbles. There's lots of Mr. Bigs. Well, there are no Mr. Bigs, there's just a million Mr. Smalls. It doesn't matter. The drug market is very similar. So, and you would all have seen in newspapers over recent years, and that's 1998, so in almost the last 18 to 20 years, more and more large, very significant seizures of heroin, of cocaine, of ice and the like in the hundreds of kilograms. But at the end of the day, the marketplace is still floating. It is still totally unregulated. The people who want to make a huge profit out of it continue to do so, and every now and again we lock up a few millions. And in a sense the Sukumaran and Chan situation is exactly a very graphic example of that. You've got 9 young kids, all of whom were serving life and 2 of whom are now dead, who between them were importing about 8 kilograms. They're one of a million. They're being used by, clearly not the Mr. Bigs. They're just the blue-collar workers being offered a few bob to do something stupid as a courier, failing to get through the net and finishing up absolutely and utterly not only ruining their own lives, but ruining the lives of their broader family and bringing a lot of heartache to a lot of people. John Howard in 1998 brought in what became known nationally as the tough on drugs policy. I was at that time the AFP Commissioner, and we had, as part of our mandate, we created a whole range of strike teams aimed at drug trafficking and drug production, drug importation particularly. That, in my view, is the end of the marketplace for which law enforcement clearly has a role. Try to cut the marketplace, aim at the fellows who are making most profit, the people who are making most profit and are doing most damage. But to continue to criminalise the other end of the market, the users and the possessors, and to treat them as criminals, not as victims, because many of these people are drug dependent, the others are just social users having a good time. 5 years later, they'll look back and say how stupid that was, thank Christ I got off it. But at the end of the day, in the meantime, to treat them as criminals is almost, to my mind, totally counterproductive. If we look at the law enforcement initiatives in the United States, you probably get the most graphic example of the failure of the process you could find if, no matter where you looked. They've spent over recent years something like $3 trillion on drug prohibition and law enforcement. They have, as you know, the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, authority, which does nothing else except drug investigations. They have a huge, as a result of that, a huge incarceration rate. The prison rate in the United States is the highest in the world, and by far the highest in the Western world. Most of those people are in for drug-related offences. But the United States continues to have an undiminished supply chain right across the country. Northern Mexico has degenerated basically into a virtual drug cartel stronghold, feeding the United States market. So on the back of this huge investment in law enforcement prohibition, you've got the northern end of a country on the back of Colombia passing the ball to Mexico, where since between 2006 and 2012, 64,000 people were murdered, most of whom were murdered in regard to drug-related activity. 64,000 homicides in 6 years, 12,000 of which occurred in 2012. And you've probably seen the photographs of people hung up from overpasses on major freeways. Some of those people did no more than simply refuse to assist the cartel, to refuse to turn a blind eye, try to tell the police about what was going on in their village or town. They weren't all other drug cartel members. You know, the violence was indiscriminatory. It was hugely violent, and the numbers are just horrific. So, if that's an example of success, I'm sort of not too sure what failure looks like, but it seems to me that we're not doing too well. In 2011, I remember well that we had a range of surveys in regard to, having a look, being prepared to. My position's always been this, I guess. I'm not into drug use, and I'd love to see nobody take illicit drugs. I don't think it does any of us any good. I mean, I'd like to stop drinking alcohol completely, but I'm just not quite strong enough to do it. But I mean, none of it does us too much good. But you can't regulate life out of people, and people will make choices, and adult people, obviously will make choices, some of which are not always sensible or in their best interests. That we should do everything we can to deter people from smoking, from taking illicit drugs, from doing other things that are harmful to ourselves, and that way we minimise the burden on ourselves as a society, maximise our individual health. But we've got to, at the same time, assess the way in which we oversight, control and perform that process to ensure that we don't cause more harm than good. And in the drug prohibitionist terms, in my view, whilst we should do all we can to educate people and to treat and divert people from harmful drugs and to give them all the support we possibly can, we've dropped the ball in terms of finding a simplistic solution, essentially driven by the United States. I mean, our governments, plural, of whichever persuasion, don't even want to start the debate. Privately, and I've had lots of discussions privately with politicians on both sides, they all agree it's broken. David Campbell, when he was opposition leader in the United Kingdom before becoming Prime Minister, that may end on Saturday, I suppose, as well, but said, it's broken, we all know it's broken, and it's been broken for a very long time. But having become Prime Minister, he did nothing that I could see to change the policy. They're not prepared to enter the debate because of the fear of the public backlash, which is caused by fear itself, which is caused by generally a lack of understanding of the reality of the problem. So they don't want to start the debate. And the challenge, as I see it, is to get people to recognise what we've got is so dreadfully broken and so counterproductive and so harmful to the very young people we're trying to protect that we need to entertain a debate as to how the hell we change it. It can't be as good as we can have. How do we get a process in place that is far more likely to achieve the benefits that the present process is trying to achieve but fails miserably to do? Tony Abbott said last year that we all know that we can't win the war on drugs. It seemed to me, and I thought that's a strong statement really for a Prime Minister to make. They don't often even make that statement. But surely that should be the basis of saying, for that reason alone, let's have a discussion about what else we can do. How do we improve it? What do we change to make it better? I remember the Luxembourg Prime Minister in a very prominent forum in the United States saying, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected once we do it. And I think in a sense that sums up the dilemma for all of us. So, easy to criticise obviously, and it took me a long time to come to this position, but I had it before I retired, and I said it publicly before I retired, just a little easier to say it more widely publicly when you have retired. Sadly that's the nature of the beast. But Ken Lane, the former Chief Commissioner of Victoria, who has just recently been appointed as the head of the Prime Minister's ICE task force, the task force looking at what the hell you can do about ICE, said as part of his opening and acceptance sort of speech, we can't police our way out of this process. There have to be other ways by which we address the issue. Just to have a police simplistic attitude to this and just to lock up all those that stick their head above the turret is to defeat the very purpose of trying to serve, and is guaranteed to fail, completely guaranteed to fail. So, what could we do? I think the first thing we've got to do is identify that illicit drug use is a social and health issue and not a criminal issue. Start the education young, so you start educating kids in primary school, as we do in a whole range of other issues, and we've been quite successful in a range of other legal issues, about the dangers and the reasons why people shouldn't do it. People will always experiment. The more forbidden the fruit is, the more we want it. You make the fruit easy to get. Nobody scrumps apples from the neighbour's tree when he tells you you can take them. But if the bloke's got a high fence and says, you scrump my apples and I'll set my dogs on you, instantly you think, I'm going to prove I can do that. So we've all been down that track, and that's the nature of human life, that, you know, if it's forbidden fruit, it becomes more attractive. So first of all, identifying that this is not a criminal issue and shouldn't be treated that way in terms of use and possession. Better focusing law enforcement efforts so they are focused purely on the production and trafficking end of the marketplace, where the benefits are likely to be highest, where the problem is most serious, where the violence is by far the most serious, and where the harms are likely to be lowest. In other words, the guys making the most profit out of this. We've got guys in this country, and I drive past their homes on the Gold Coast with these huge boats out the back and these huge cars out the front, who live on unemployment benefits. I'm not so sure how you do that, but if there's a way to do it, I've obviously lost it in the process. We don't get near them most times. We don't scratch the surface. But every now and again, some of those mules, like the Sukumarans and Chans of the world and others, we net, and more sadly, we net the people who just use and possess, including at rock festivals and the like. And then we get more serious about it because some young woman or man dies, when one of the problems is that the reason most of those people get into trouble and die is the fact they're trying to do it in a secretive way. They don't quite know what they bought, or the toxicity of what they bought. If they get ill, people pretend it's something else, it's food poisoning. They don't want to phone mum or dad and tell them. They'll often tell the ambulance or the medics who respond the wrong story in the first place. By the time people work out what the hell's going on and what really is wrong with the person, it's often too late. Frequently, the fact of it being illegal is the cause of the medical problem and often the death. That alone should be enough to get our attention and say, well, wow, you know, what are we trying to achieve? What are we achieving? Reallocating drug-related funding. Law enforcement gets far too big a slice of the cake, quite frankly. Not enough money is spent on health, treatment, diversions, education processes. Far too much money is spent on law enforcement. You give me a big bundle of money, I'll find a way to spend it. When Howard had his 1996 or 1997 tough on drugs policy and threw a bundle of money at us to create these strike teams, I had to sort of invent the strike teams and work out who the hell we were going to strike at, because we didn't exactly have a pile of intelligence to tell us, a bit like now we're seeing with counter-terrorism. Lots of money thrown at law enforcement for counter-terrorism activities, but you've got to have the basis upon which to say, okay, what does that mean? You know, what does a terrorist look like? You've got to have the intelligence to focus your inquiries, and of course that takes time and effort and money, but you'll always find a way to do more if in fact you're given enough money with which to do it. And so that's the nature of all organisations, I guess, but it's certainly the nature of law enforcement. You know, there's no bottom to the pit. I'll do as much work as you give me money to do. If I only have one, the best way to double a crime rate in a town is to put a police officer there. A little village with no police officers has almost a zero crime rate. You whack a police officer in the town and all of a sudden you've got one. Behaviour doesn't really change much, people just report more. You know, but at the end of the day, they were really regulating themselves quite adequately. No one felt unsafe, no one was in fear of their own safety, but you put a police officer or two in the town and of course they generate their own business. It's the way it is, and that's not all wrong, but you know, you've got to sort of be prepared to look at that and say, well, you know, at the end of the day, how necessary is that? You know, what are the goods we're achieving, what are the harms we're causing? We've got to think about, and as part of that, dealing, as I said, with the users of social drugs, particularly, as victims and not as criminals. You've got to foster an environment where they're encouraged and facilitated, to be honest. When something goes wrong and they get ill, or a mate gets ill, or a friend gets ill, they're likely to tell the truth, report the matter to medical authorities, tell their mum and dad about it, whatever it is. And some of these people are pretty young kids. So you remove the stigma, you remove the fear, you remove the discrimination. As part of the process, as I said, you improve the education and deterrence initiatives associated with that. We think about decriminalisation. You probably have heard in recent times Premier Mike Baird talking about the moves they're making now to sort of legalise medicinal cannabis. And I've been involved in some aspects of that. And the evidence in support of medicinal cannabis is overwhelming. I mean, some of the tragic cases with just huge epileptic conditions where young children were having fits every 8 and 10 seconds and this sort of thing, you know, like 200 seizures a day, which were almost ameliorated to the point of 1 a week simply by using controlled medicinal cannabis. You know, those sort of stories leap out at you from all around the world. And Australian families having to go to the United States and pick certain states within the United States to give themselves access to medicinal cannabis. Even in the face of that evidence, it's taken a long time, and now sadly the death of the son of the woman who started the campaign in New South Wales, for governments to take notice of it. Mike Baird's one of the few that has said, look, the evidence is pretty striking, we'll have a crack at this. You know, we'll control it, we'll make sure it's only given out in careful quantities to the people who really need it, but at the end of the day, to treat these people as criminals. It came out of a very brave position by Lou and Don, I can't think his surname, he's Christian now. Haslam, Lou Haslam and Lucy Haslam and Lou and Lucy Haslam, whose son Dan was critically ill with cancer, who was getting frequent seizures, could be ameliorated, stopped in fact, prevented by medicinal cannabis, or by cannabis for medicinal purposes. He started accessing it illegally. His mother went public to say this is what we're doing. Her husband, Dan's father, Lou, was a former police officer from the Drug and Armed Offender Squad of New South Wales. The local superintendent, a fellow called Clint Feeney, came out publicly and said, I've given my members an order that they will exercise their discretion and not take action against Dan Haslam for accessing cannabis for medicinal purposes. He lived for a long time. It became a major campaign. They had, a few months ago, we had a huge rally in Tamworth, which is their hometown. As a result of that, Mike Baird attended that. He made an announcement that a medicinal cannabis trial would occur, and as a result of that, the law is moving to change. And discretionary rules are being written for New South Wales Police that in regard to medicinal cannabis, they are to exercise their discretion not to take criminal action, not to arrest people for use and possession. But they were still having to access it illegally, and still are, because the laws haven't come into place. And young Dan Haslam sadly died about 2 months ago. But so it's not going to benefit him. But the plight of the situation, when you sat in the audience and listened to some of the stories, and you thought, you know, in the face of this evidence, how much evidence do you need politically before you're prepared to have a crack and have a more sincere look at this and to do something about it? And while that's a very acute and narrow case, the broader case of decriminalisation is sort of equally compelling in the sense of the damage we cause and the situation, the environment we create by maintaining a criminal attitude to social use and possession of the sort of drugs that young people are taking every day of the week. You don't talk to anybody, I don't talk to any young person who doesn't know exactly where they can buy whatever it is they want to buy, and most of them can afford to do it. Where law enforcement is not exactly being very effective at its best of times. Part of so thinking about decriminalising cannabis, as baby steps, let's think about how do we take the marketplace away. It's no different to the alcohol prohibition in the United States in the 1920s. You know, ran and controlled by people like Al Capone until they legalised it. And immediately, organised crime left the scene. Organised criminals are very lazy bastards. They're not very, you know, they're criminals because they're too lazy to work in the main aspect of it. They are there for the profit. They want to get as much profit as they can, as quickly as they can, and as easily as they can. The moment you make the marketplace difficult, they'll look for another marketplace. You've got to take the marketplace from under their feet, limit the marketplace, and they might then go somewhere else. But while you leave the marketplace totally unregulated, we get no benefit from it as a society. They get huge profits from it, and of course the people who buy it have no idea what it is they're buying. So I think by decriminalising step by step different drugs, thinking about whether we could regulate the supply, as they are now doing in several countries and several states of America across the world. So the government now is the source of supply, a bit like prescription medicines. So at least people that buy it, you still try to make sure that you educate people that there's not much sense in this. But if you're going to purchase cannabis, here's where you buy it. You'll know what it is you're buying. You'll know the quantity you're buying. There are two reefers in that or whatever, and the toxicity of it. So there's no surprises. You can trust the quality of the product, just like an ordinary legal business product. Therefore you minimise the damage that can be caused by people taking drugs of a a higher toxicity than which they believed they were taking. I mean, one of the major initiatives of organised crime is to feed people in the sex industry drugs and make them dependent upon it. And the way to do that quickly, of course, is to give them a drug that is far more toxic than the one they believe they're taking. And then, of course, they just rely totally on the person who runs them for their drugs and will do exactly what it is they're asked to do for the purpose of getting them. I mean, we ought to be a lot more concerned about that, it seems to me, than we are at the moment. So, there's a lot of things wrong with what we've got. I think we've taken a big stick. It's all too politically easy for governments to brush it under the carpet on the basis that we'll frighten people if we look like we're going to go soft on drugs. And I remember when I was involved in a report released last year saying we should think about at least having a genuine debate, and politicians agreed privately. We really do need a genuine debate about what's right and wrong with what we now have and how the hell do we improve it, what could we do sensibly to improve it, could we decriminalise certain drugs, could we regulate supply, how would we go about it? Is it worth doing trials? Do you do it nationally or just do it in select locations? Not unlike the King's Cross early closure process and all that sort of stuff. You look at the figures, so geez, they speak for themselves a bit. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. How about we have a crack? But the moment you come to a public debate, I remember Julia Gillard as the Prime Minister at the time saying something like, there'll be no change on my beat. I remember the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, my previous home state at the time, saying, you know, we will not be entering the debate, there'll be no change on my watch. Won't enter the debate, not going to even have the discussion. That to me is pretty tragic, and we ought to be a more mature nation than that. And as people, I mean, Australians, as you know, we're pretty apathetic. It takes a lot to stir us up, and I think the apathy is something that governments work on, quite frankly. They get away with a lot simply because although we might mutter about it around a beer over in a bar at a tavern, we don't often walk in the streets, and we don't make the sort of noise in opposition to those sorts of idiot decisions that we perhaps should, and that other countries, I think, much more likely would. Now, Winston Churchill once famously said, no matter how brilliant the strategy, you should sometimes look at the results. And I think if ever there's a strategy that screams out for us to look at the results and say, Jesus Christ, this can't possibly be as good as we can get. We can't possibly be happy and satisfied with this policy. It is our current drug prohibitionist policy. And I think it's time we did exactly that. We looked at the results. Thanks very much.
Now I think we're probably out of time to have a Q&A period because it's already, we can take one. I'll take one question, sorry. I'll just bring you the mic.
I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The question relates to how you and when you came to the realization that you were fighting the wrong fight, and how you manage yourself to continue doing what you were doing while at the same time you knew that you were not doing what you should be doing.
What I should, yeah. That's a very good question. I came to the realisation, I guess, gradually. First experiences pretty early on in my life, really. I remember when I was a young drug detective in the Northern Territory, and I was involved in a drug case which caused the arrest of half a dozen people in a home in Darwin. All of them at the time we arrested them were dressed in caftans. They were only smoking cannabis, only had cannabis in the house, but they had quite a sizable sum of it, so as a result of which they finished up before the Supreme Court. And when I was giving evidence, I went to the trial, they pleaded not guilty, went to the trial. They all turned up, and at the time they had long hair and beards and looked like the reincarnation of Jesus Christ in the main, and they had caftans on, typical hippies at the time, which I found a bit offensive because, I was a police officer and, that's what they looked like, druggies, and that's what they were. So I went to court and they turned up in suits and looked $1 million. Clean-cut young guys. And when I gave evidence, I said I spoke to the defendant now before the court, Fred Smersh, who at the time was dressed in a caftan, had long hair and a beard. Anyway, and when I gave my evidence, when the recess occurred in the court, the Supreme Court judge called me up to his chambers. I went to the chambers, he said, look, thank you for your evidence this morning, but I have to tell you that what he wore at the time had no relevance at all to the case. And I think we tried a little bit too hard to paint a picture. And he was dead right. And I thought about that, and I thought, you know, I'm losing sight of the objectivity a bit here. I was just painting the picture I wanted to paint, coming to the conclusion I wanted to come. I first started to think about it as early as that. The other part of your question, you obviously have an obligation, it's a bit of a cop-out in a sense, but I guess it's right. You've got an obligation to apply, if you're going to stay in policing, particularly when I became a commissioner, my obligation is to apply the laws of the country. It's not for me to only apply the ones I think we should apply and ignore the ones I think we shouldn't, unless the law allows me that appropriate discretion. And we exercise a lot of discretion along the lines of the Haslam case I mentioned in all policing. And New South Wales does do that a lot. For example, they won't arrest people who have an MOU or a standing order, general guideline, that says people who report a drug overdose are not to be questioned or arrested for drug use themselves. So to take away the fear of somebody saying Mick's had an overdose on the basis that we were going to get picked up if the coppers turn up. So they don't ordinarily arrest the people in the presence of and in the company of somebody who has a drug overdose. Exercising those discretions, but you've got a lawful obligation obviously to apply the law. But it always seems to me you've got a much better chance of changing something from inside than from outside. And I guess that's what I tried to do. And I had lots of conversations with different people, including in the political field, about why we shouldn't continue doing some of the things we did. And in fairness to Prime Minister Howard at the time, this tough on drugs policy that really became known as just the war on drugs, really had more money spent on health and treatment and diversion options than what it did on law enforcement. So it was focused on both supply and demand, and he had a lot of money associated with demand and minimising harm. It was really quite a good comprehensive package, but of course it got, in the media terms, the only thing we focused on was the war on drugs and strike teams and arresting all these bad guys. Not much was spent on the fact that we set up a whole range of drug courts and diversionary systems to keep people out of prison and treatment options for people and so on, and ways by which we could get people off of dependency and so on. And over time, that's been further and further deteriorated or ameliorated, and now there's nowhere near as much money spent on that as there is on law enforcement. And things like, counter-terrorism, and politicians, in my experience, see police and defence as being just about a cure-all to anything. Serious problem comes along, throw it to the defence force or throw it to the coppers and they'll fix it. And of course, that's very simplistic. So often we make it worse, we don't make it better, and so often we don't have the skills to do it at all. But they give us the money, so we have a crack. So I came to the realisation slowly. I did try to change things while I was inside. I realised when I got out, towards the end of my time actually, that we hadn't really taken many steps forward, and I've been trying much more vigorously since I retired, but that's 15 bloody years and we still haven't taken too many steps. So, it's a hard road, and I just think we have to keep chipping away, and it really needs more people in the public. It's really what is my cry here today, if you like, to start to question the status quo. So look, this is not. If it's your son and daughter who all of a sudden can't join the Defence Force or become a teacher, we get very alarmed. If it's your young son or daughter who dies of an overdose at a rock festival because kids wouldn't tell the medical people what was wrong with them, we suddenly say, Jesus, what's wrong with this process? I mean, we have to look at better ways to do business.